Hello and welcome to Tech Talks with Matt. I'm Matt Hennessy from Microfocus, and I'm delighted to be joined today by James Boucher, but I've been told we can call him Jimmy, so I'm going to call him Jimmy from now on, who's joining us from Liberty Life Insurance. Hello, James.
Good day, Matt. Good to be part of the team today.
Oh, in fact, we're so grateful to have you with us. We decided to create this series, these episodes of Tech Talks with Matt, but they really would be nothing without speaking to people like you and experts like you. I know today we're going to touch on a few topics, but we really wanted to, we're going to try and look at sort of simplification. And actually saying simplification, I've probably oversimplified simplification, but simplification and cloud and all these things that we hear about businesses, you know, the buzzwords people want to do and move. But what in the case of Liberty and I guess the journey you're on, what does simplification mean for you? How is that work playing out?
Matt, so Liberty being a life insurance company, been around for quite some time now, here in the region of 60 odd years. And what started out initially way back, as you progress, you build systems, you put solutions in play to achieve certain business outcomes. But that in the long run, you get to a point where you realize, okay, with all the new fintechs as they're being called today, they come up and you need to either make your business easier or make it easier for people to work with you. So from a simplification perspective, it's that how do you get that legacy, if I can call it, of systems which you build up over these many years, how do you simplify that component and how do you make it easier to work with? Unfortunately, part of the game with regards to that, so you've got systems that old, well, you're running also out of people, literally, which understand those technologies as they were built 60 years old. So that's part of the biggest thing to say from a simplification journey. How do you make your life easier, your business easier, and at the same time, how do you become competitive again?
And I guess, you know, we're talking tech at the moment, but it's so much more than tech, isn't it? And there's a lot of the simplification when you talk about legacy or maybe moving from mainframes to cloud or whatever these might be, is the culture, the business culture, and the appetite for what can sometimes be seen as, well, might be seen as increased risk or loss of control. How do you find that side of things? How is the appetite of the executives, if you like, for these
so
changes?
From with regards to a lot of those specific components, yes, it's a tech component. The executives will tell you, yes, we need to simplify the business. We need to make it easier. We need to keep up with where you are. But so that's a line to say that's what we need to drive. You're almost what I can say, where you get sticky with regard to that is in the execution part, is to say, okay, but as you start going through it, that's when you realize how complex and how difficult is it to move something or to make something simpler. We always, initially, there was a joke to say, if you move to cloud, it's just drag and drop. Well, I wish it was that simple. But it's a matter to say, as you start to work through those systems, you realize, okay, this is the functionality they did. Because people perspective, a human being can only remember so much, and most what is using on a daily basis or familiar with. But there's those little things which happens maybe once a year or and it's those logic and components which you do. So the word to say, yes, migrate is fine, but it's the associated risk with it to say, okay, now you've moved your system. Okay, great. It works, it continues. The customer doesn't know you did all of this because that's behind the scenes. But it's to say from a risk perspective, what functionality and issues is the customer going to face, which is going to throw back at you? And that's the associated risk which you mentioned, which then comes up to say, okay, how do we deal with that? How do you mitigate it? And then where I don't want to say the problem arises, but that's where the truth comes back to the executive to say, this is the practical and real situation we are in order to achieve something which is just called simplification or migrate to cloud. Then they start to realize how complex it is, and then all of a sudden it becomes a money issue, because now you realize you're going to need to spend a significant amount of money in order to achieve the specific objective. So you've got executive buy-in, but it's a matter to say, how deep is the pockets in order to achieve that specific objective?
Yeah, and do you think I guess the idea that your stuff, when it's in a big room somewhere, or it's in a building and you can see it, and people feel more secure in that, and potentially have been worried about it going to the cloud or somewhere else, do you think those business issues, or those leader issues with where the data sits, do you think those have gone away now?
To a lot of extent, the culture change with regards to that, that has gone away. So a lot of the components from a security perspective and everything from a liberties perspective, because of some data privacy issues and all of the legislation which you need to do it, so you need to focus a lot on that. So that's less of an issue with regards to executives to say, okay, but it's cloud-based. They know you put in as much controls and you rely on your service providers like AWS, Microsoft Azure, in order to put stuff in play. You put stuff in play as much as you can, but it's the same as if you've got your own data center. It's nothing less. You try to protect yourself to the best you can, and you hope for the best from that perspective.
Yeah, it absolutely. I mean, it's not a technical question, is it? It's more it's a perception.
Correct. 100%
yeah.
correct.
Yeah, and and so you just mentioned about legislation and that side of things. So is there a lot of legislation that governs your role in terms of the technical architecture, and do you have to pay attention to a lot of rules and regulations?
Yes, so obviously Liberty being an long-term insurance company, we've got certain legislations, which is the most one which comes into play next year, early mid next year, is your protection of personal information. How do you deal with that? So in the European countries, it's called GDPR, which is an extension of components. It's exactly the same. So you've got all of that legislation, and because we're classified as a financial services company, you've got that additional legislation components which you also need to adhere to. So, and yeah, then Liberty being acquired by Standard Bank, the minority shares. So that means from next year, when that acquisition is completed, you've got all of a sudden bank regulations which you need to adhere to, and not only your insurance regulations, which is much stricter. But so you've got that on a daily basis to say, what is the regulations we need to apply to? So all of your components and all of those decisions you make is in conjunction to say, how do you mitigate that risk so that you don't expose you to risk that you are in breach of any of your regulatory components?
And I guess the move away from legacy, let's say, we need a better word, but the move away from legacy will make it easier and more, you'll be able to respond to changes more quickly, I guess, in a cloud environment. So actually gearing yourself up for those potential legislative, there we go, changes. Yeah, how does that work?
Correct.
I mean, that's an assumption.
So that's part of the component, is to say, over time, your regulators, if you look at your anti-money laundering components, which has been quite pushed significant in the last few years to say what companies and organizations and countries need to adhere to. So with the protection of personal information, that's an extension and to become. So as your countries and your regulatory authorities also start gearing themselves up into technology components, they start to ask more information from you as an organization to assist them to try and combat that component of anti-money laundering. People start to your regulatory authorities easier gets complaints to say, but as an example, call centers keep on calling me, but I haven't given out my detail. Okay, so now with the protection of personal income or information being come into effect, now it's a matter to say, okay, but how did you as a company or as a telemarketer obtain that customer's information? Are you in breach of a regulatory component? So that's where then, so all of that information which you now all of a sudden need to share and make available, if you're in a cloud-based environment and you've simplified your systems, yes, that specific objectives becomes easier, because hopefully with that whole objective you try to move to cloud and make your system simpler, you can respond faster to stuff like that. And potentially future changes which might become because of a regular nature might be easier.
Yeah, and I guess it's not just a case of you'll get some of the sort of the collective value, I guess, of that cloud service provider, because
Correct.
they will be looking at these changes to help support their customers as well. You're not
Exactly.
on your own.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's lots of changes, and so on your sort of simplification journey, and obviously these things are never done because there's always ongoing. But how far along are you? Are you rid of legacy as we?
No. So we've got a 3-4 year journey to move away from legacy environments and mainframe components, as we're running applications on a mainframe component. And that takes time to plan. So we're in the process to identify, analyze all the applications to see what do they do, how do they function. And then the biggest thing is to say, okay, find an alternative. Okay, great. But because it's so integrated with other systems, it becomes more of a component to say, what do you put in play in order to support the remaining applications when you remove something out, that portion or the function, that you don't break your business, because that literally, the interdependencies on mainframe, as an example, is quite big. So if you move some of those applications, you can literally break the business to say, like, there's all of a sudden a customer facing system or a critical system will no longer be able to function. So we currently in a lot of planning and analysis components to say what you need to do so that, and that was what a big portion of this year specifically was about, was to say, analyze components, identify components, and come up with potential new houses, if you want to call it, for those components that you can start with your execution of component, because we've got roughly 2-3 years left in order to conclude it. So, but yeah, we still, you can say we are at between 20 and 40% mark of what we're trying to achieve. But yes, still a lot of work.
And a lot of those worrying moments when you move things and hope that you've done all the bits right and nothing's going to fall over.
Correct.
And yeah, that's, I mean, you guys are obviously pretty expert at this as you're working through it. What advice would you give someone else in your position who hasn't started their journey? Or, you know, from what you've learned, what advice would you give someone?
So the biggest component which I said, for instance, which I've learned, and which is for me, from information and a data architecture perspective, is to say it's all good and well we move the applications, but because it's a legacy application, it's to say, and systems being created so far, and in some cases it's in-house built systems, which makes it even worse, to say, now you've migrated, it's with regards to what's the application logical components which you lose, so that when somebody asks you or questions or wants an answer from a migrated product, how do you answer that and make sure that you've kept that logic and component in play? Because you obviously just migrate the application. If you migrate the product itself, it's a total different ballgame, because then you create a brand new system. So in many cases, that's where I'm currently almost in the middle component to say, is it worth the exercise to migrate applications? Or do we rather go and say, you know what, this is what this product did, create a similar product, but rather just put it on a brand new platform.
Mm,
And I'm currently in those two minds to say, ain't it maybe easier just to migrate to a newer technology, a product, than to take an application and to move it? But that's something, some of the components which we are also now evaluating as we analyze the stuff, is to say, what recommendations do you do? But it's never a thing to say, nah, just ignore it.
mm,
You have to migrate the application. In some cases, you realize it might be cost effective to migrate the product itself just to a different platform.
mm. Yeah, it's well, as I started, simplification is not the right word really, because it's anything
No,
but simple.
correct.
No, brilliant. Thanks, Jimmy. This is really interesting. I mean, looking to the year ahead, what are you most excited about? What's coming, maybe? And it sounds like you've got a lot of hard work to do, but within that, what are you excited about?
So the biggest components which we've got to say is with regards to, so obviously with the Liberty Standard Bank merger component, there's an exciting thing to say. Everything you've planned to this year, now all of a sudden you're part of a new group of company in a company workings everything. So yeah, so that might throw a few curveballs to say how we
Mm,
thought about stuff and want to do stuff. It changed because you're now aligned to a new company culture. But at least from that perspective, the silver lining, if you want to call it, is it's not unfamiliar people. We've been working with them for a while. Just now, from a legal piece of paper, you're part of the group, you're a fully owned subsidiary.
and
So that makes it a little bit easier.
and do you know, have they had a similar journey in terms of
Yes,
simplify? So okay, so it matches. It's not as if you're going to join and they're going to say, whoa, we're not ready to do this sort of thing.
correct. They've got exactly the same thing, same journey, same type of scenario. So Standard Bank, as a bank in South Africa, is, I think, over 100 years old. So they also have got legacy systems which they need to address and component to say. Also, similar to your new digital fintech company banks who comes up, who gives products and respond faster. Well, you're in the same boat as what they call a major bank, to say, how do you do to still also keep up, but make your systems and functions also with regards to make it simpler to do business with a bank.
Yeah. Well, and as the younger generations, the digital natives and all these terms, they're not sort of even wanting to log on to computers, or certainly going to branches. And I guess that change, everything
Correct.
changes, doesn't it? And they don't want to be on
Yes.
phones. Jimmy, thank you so much. This has been really interesting, and I hope for you viewers, viewers or listeners, you've taken some really insightful bits away from this. I'll sort of draw this to a close now, Jimmy. Is there any final thoughts you want to leave?
No, nothing specifically from my side, Matt. It's been a journey, and I assume it will continue to be a journey on this specific topic. But other than that, nothing from my side. Thank you very much for the
No, but
opportunity.
thank you. I mean, it's good to see you're still smiling, so it can't have been that bad. No, well, and so thanks again, and thanks everyone for tuning in to this episode of Tech Talks with Matt. I'll look forward to reaching you on the next episode. Thank you.